April 11th, 1945. The soldiers of the 3rd Armored Division walked into the tunnels at Nordhausen, Germany. What they found stopped them cold. Not enemy fire, not booby traps. Bodies, hundreds of them, stacked against the tunnel walls, lying in the dirt. Some still breathing, most not. The smell hit before the light did. These were the men who had built Germany's secret weapon, the V2 rocket, the most advanced flying machine the world had ever seen. They had been worked to death, in the dark, underground, building a weapon for people who considered them disposable. 20,000 prisoners died in those tunnels. That number is not disputed. It is in the records. The American soldiers who found them were outraged. The army filmed it, called it a crime, made a propaganda reel to show the world what Nazi Germany had done. And then, a different group of Americans arrived. These men were not there to bear witness. They were not there to document atrocity. They were there for the rockets. And within weeks, the men who had built those rockets on the backs of slave labor were on their way to the United States, with new names, new files, new futures, paid for by the American taxpayer, protected by the American government, hidden from the American public, for decades. This is the story of Operation Paperclip, and it is one of the most consequential and most deliberately buried programs in the history of American intelligence. Let's start where the story really starts. Not in Germany, not in the tunnels, in a university bathroom in Bonn. March 1945. A Polish laboratory technician was cleaning the men's room. He found something stuffed into the toilet. Paper, wet, but not destroyed. He pulled it out, dried it off, and read what was on it. It was a list. 15,000 names. German scientists, engineers, rocket specialists, biological weapons experts, aviation researchers. The list had been compiled by a Nazi official named Werner Osenberg. It was supposed to be destroyed before the Allies arrived. Someone had tried, not hard enough. That list eventually reached British intelligence, which passed it to American intelligence. And the race began, not the space race, not yet, the race to get German brains before the Russians did. Because both sides understood the same thing in the spring of 1945. The war was almost over, and whoever came out of it with the most advanced science would own the next war before it started. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the American program that would become Operation Paperclip, was given a simple directive. Find them, bring them home. Don't let Moscow have them. Simple, except for one problem. President Harry Truman had specifically prohibited the program from recruiting anyone who had been a member of the Nazi Party, a war criminal, or an active participant in the persecution of civilians, which described almost every scientist on the list. So the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency made a decision. They would fix the files. How do you hide a man's past? In 1945, you did it with paper. Every scientist brought into the Paperclip program received a new dossier, a clean summary, written by American intelligence officers, attached to the original file, with a paperclip. That is where the name came from, not some dramatic espionage metaphor, a literal office supply, used to attach a lie to the truth, and bury the truth underneath it. The clean summaries said things like, not an active Nazi, no known war crimes, recommended for recruitment. The original files, buried beneath, said things like, member of the Nazi Party since 1937, SS officer, supervised slave labor operations, present at concentration camp facilities. Both documents existed. Both were in the same folder. One was shown to immigration officials and State Department reviewers. The other one was not. This was not an accident. It was policy. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency reviewed the files, modified what needed to be modified, passed what needed to be passed, and moved the scientists through the system. 1,600 of them, between 1945 and 1959, to Fort Bliss in Texas, to Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, to Huntsville, Alabama, to classified facilities across the country, each one carrying a file that described a man who had never existed. Now, let me tell you about Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun. Because if you've watched any documentary about the Apollo program, if you grew up watching the moon landing, if you remember where you were on July 20th, 1969, you know this name. He was the man who built the rocket that got us there, the Saturn V. The most powerful machine human beings had ever constructed, the rocket that carried Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin to the surface of the moon. Werner von Braun was a hero. On the cover of Time magazine, on Disney television, the face of American ambition, the proof that science and dream could do the impossible. And all of that is true. He did build the Saturn V. He did help put men on the moon. He was, by any measure of rocket engineering, a genius. Here is what else is true. Werner von Braun joined the Nazi Party in May of 1937. Not under pressure, not as cover. He joined because it was useful. In November of 1941, Heinrich Himmler himself granted von Braun a commission in the SS. He became an SS Sturmbannführer, a major, in the most feared organization in the Third Reich. He visited the Mittelbau-Dora production facility, the tunnel complex at Nordhausen, at least a dozen times. He saw what was there: prisoners in striped uniforms, walking skeletons, working 16-hour shifts in conditions that killed them faster than they could be replaced. 350 of them were hanged between 1943 and 1945. 200 of those hangings were for sabotage. You want to know what sabotage looked like in those tunnels? A loose screw, a bad weld, a prisoner urinating on an electrical component. Acts of quiet desperation by men who knew they were dying, and decided to take a rocket with them if they could. Werner von Braun knew all of this. He was the technical director of the V2 program. He made decisions about production. He received reports about output. He needed those rockets built. And they were built. On the bodies of 20,000 people who died to build them. The V2, historians have noted, holds a grim distinction. It is the only weapon system in history that killed more people during its manufacture than it killed in combat. 9,000 people died when V2s struck London, Antwerp, and other cities. 20,000 died building them. Werner von Braun knew this. And in May of 1945, when Germany collapsed and Allied forces were closing in, he made a choice. He didn't run east. He didn't hide. He went down a mountain, with a bottle of cognac and a smile. In the Austrian Alps, on May 2, 1945, von Braun and approximately 125 of his top team members surrendered to American forces. He had specifically chosen to find Americans rather than Soviets. He understood what his value was. He understood what he was trading it for. An American private named Fred Schneikert was the first soldier to encounter von Braun. Von Braun's arm was in a cast, broken in a car accident weeks before. He spoke English. He identified himself immediately. He told Schneikert he was a rocket scientist and he wanted to talk to someone in authority. Within hours, he was speaking to American intelligence officers. Within weeks, he was on his way to the United States. His SS membership, his Nazi party card, his documented visits to the Nordhausen facility, all of it was placed in the original file, and a clean summary was attached, with a paperclip. Now here is something the history books tend to gloss over. What happened in the weeks between the liberation of Nordhausen and the arrival of the paperclip scientists in America? April 11, 1945. American soldiers liberate the tunnels, film the bodies, express outrage. Late April, early May 1945. A different group of Americans arrives. Their mission is called Special Mission V2, commanded by Major William Bromley. They have a problem. The Nordhausen facility is in what will become the Soviet occupation zone. Under the agreements reached at Yalta, the Soviets are entitled to it. But the rockets are there. The parts for 100 V2s. Specifications, blueprints, equipment. The Americans have approximately 3 weeks before Soviet forces arrive and claim the zone. Major Bromley's team worked around the clock, They loaded 341 rail cars, 14 tons of documents, parts for 100 missiles, and moved all of it out of the Soviet zone before the deadline. The Soviets arrived to find empty tunnels, stripped clean. The bodies of the prisoners were still there. Those, nobody shipped west. Just the technology. Let me tell you about Kurt Blome. Kurt Blome. He was not a rocket scientist. He was a doctor. Or rather, he held that title. During the war, Blome ran the biological weapons program for Nazi Germany. He conducted experiments on human beings at a facility called Posen, using prisoners from concentration camps as test subjects. Plague, tuberculosis, other agents. He tested them on people who had no choice about being tested on. In 1947, Kurt Blome was indicted at the Nuremberg doctors' trial. The prosecutors presented evidence. The judges deliberated. He was acquitted. The circumstances of that acquittal have been called suspicious by multiple historians. Witnesses recanted. Evidence disappeared. The exact mechanics of why a man who ran a biological weapons program and experimented on human beings walked out of Nuremberg free are still not fully clear. What happened next is fully documented. 2 months after his acquittal at Nuremberg, Kurt Blome was contracted by the United States Army Chemical Corps to consult on biological weapons. The contract documents are declassified. They use the phrase, expert consultation. Expert consultation. For a man who had just been tried at Nuremberg, he worked with American biological weapons researchers. He shared what he knew, what he had learned, from the experiments, on the prisoners. This is documented. It is not in dispute. It is simply not widely known. Now we need to talk about Walter Schreiber. Walter Schreiber. He was the Surgeon General of the Wehrmacht, the German Army's top medical officer. During the war, he authorized typhus vaccine experiments on prisoners at the Buchenwald and Natzweiler concentration camps. After Germany fell, he was captured by the Soviets, held for several years, then transferred to American custody. In 1951, he arrived in the United States. Weeks after his arrival, the Boston Globe ran a story. They connected Schreiber to the human experiments. They named him. They cited the evidence. The story ran. The public read it. People were angry. Here is what happened next. The American military did not conduct an investigation, did not hold hearings, did not revoke his status or detain him. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency quietly arranged visas for Schreiber and his family. They moved to Argentina, where, it should be noted, a significant community of former Nazi officials had also found refuge. The Schreiber case was handled efficiently, quietly, without accountability. This is a good moment to ask the question that the American public never got to ask. Who knew? Was this happening without the knowledge of anyone in the government? Was it a rogue operation by a few intelligence officers acting independently? No. President Truman knew the broad outlines of the program. He had signed the order that was supposed to prevent war criminals from being recruited. And when the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency began falsifying files to get around that order, the reports went up the chain. The State Department objected. In November of 1946, the State Department's Samuel Klaus submitted a formal complaint. He had reviewed the files. He had seen what was happening. He wrote that the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency was bypassing established procedures to bring in individuals who should not be admitted under any circumstances. His objection was noted and overruled by the Department of War. The reasoning was simple. The Soviets were getting German scientists too, had been since the end of the war. The V-2 engineers who didn't make it to the American zone had been taken to Russia. Soviet rocket program. Soviet biological warfare capabilities. Soviet intelligence networks. The Cold War was already cold, and the Americans had decided that winning it was worth the cost. The cost being the truth about who these men were and what they had done. Now comes the part of this story that most people have never heard, because it happened in public, in full view, and was still suppressed for years. 1961. Werner von Braun is now the director of NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama. He is a celebrity. He has a television show. He has a magazine cover. He is the face of American progress. And the Federal Bureau of Investigation opens an investigation. Not because of Nuremberg, not because of the slave labor, because a former Dutch resistance fighter named Hammaker has submitted sworn testimony about von Braun's SS membership. The FBI investigated. They found documentation. They presented it, and the decision was made. The investigation was closed. The need to win the space race was judged to be more important than accountability for what had happened before it. Von Braun continued at NASA. He continued building rockets. The Saturn V was his crowning achievement. In 1969, 1,600 days after he personally asked President Kennedy to fund the moon program, Neil Armstrong stepped onto the lunar surface. Von Braun was at Mission Control in Houston. He wept. Later that year, he was asked to testify at a West German war crimes trial. Former SS men from the Mittelbau-Dora camp. The trial needed his account of what he had seen in the tunnels. He was by then running the most famous rocket program in the world. He was afraid that testimony would damage his reputation, and NASA's. He tried to avoid it. Eventually, he spoke. At the West German consulate in New Orleans, February 7, 1969, he minimized. He deflected. He suggested the SS had been responsible, that he had been a scientist, not an administrator. The historians who have reviewed his testimony have generally concluded it did not accurately represent what he knew, or what he saw, or what he enabled. Here is where the story gets complicated in a way that matters to Americans specifically, because the question is not just what happened. The question is what it produced. Werner von Braun's team built the Jupiter C rocket that launched America's first satellite, Explorer 1, in January of 1958. Without that satellite, the space race starts differently. Possibly worse for the United States. Werner von Braun's team built the Redstone rocket that carried Alan Shepard into space in May of 1961, the first American in space. Werner von Braun's team built the Saturn V, the rocket that, 50 years later, with all the moral complexity of this history sitting on top of it, still stands as one of the greatest engineering achievements in human history. So what do you do with that? How do you hold two things at the same time? A rocket that reached the moon, built by a man who watched prisoners die to build the weapon that made him famous. The answer, it turns out, is that most Americans were never asked to hold both things at the same time. Because one of them was classified. One of them was in the original file, under the paperclip, hidden. Arthur Rudolph. Arthur Rudolph. He was the operations director for V2 production at the Mittelwerk. Not a consultant, not an observer. The operations director. He received the daily reports about production. He received the reports about prisoner deaths. He made decisions about how to use the workforce. He received every report about sabotage. He was responsible for the responses to sabotage. Some of those responses were executions. In 1945, Arthur Rudolph arrived in the United States. His file was cleaned. He went to work. He worked on the Pershing missile. He worked on the Saturn V. He received NASA's highest honor in 1969, the Distinguished Service Medal. In 1984, nearly 40 years after the war, the Department of Justice's Office of Special Investigations finally investigated his case. They found documentation they had not previously seen, or had not previously acted on. Under the threat of prosecution, Arthur Rudolph renounced his American citizenship, moved to West Germany, which granted him citizenship. He died in 1996, without having faced a criminal trial, without having served a day. West Germany reopened an investigation in 1994, and closed it, without charging him. Arthur Rudolph died peacefully in Hamburg. He was 89 years old. 1999. The Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act was passed by Congress. It required the declassification of records related to Nazi war crimes and their aftermath. More than 8 million pages of documents were eventually released. For the first time, the full, documented story of Operation Paperclip was available to historians, journalists, and the public. Not allegations, not theories, documents, the altered files, the original files, The memoranda overriding State Department objections. The contracts with men like Kurt Blome. The arrangements made for Walter Schreiber. The SS records for Werner von Braun. All of it. In the years that followed, historians like Annie Jacobsen, who wrote the definitive book on Operation Paperclip in 2014, pieced together the full picture. What emerged was not a story of rogue agents. It was a story of institutional decision-making, deliberate, documented, and sustained over nearly 15 years. The United States government decided, in the spring of 1945, that German science was more valuable than German accountability, and then spent the next several decades making sure most Americans never had to think about that trade-off. Here is what I want you to sit with. Not the science, not even the moral complexity, the specific mechanism of what was done. A clean summary, attached to the original file. With a paperclip, the original truth was not destroyed. It was buried, filed, classified. For years, government investigators could have found it if they had looked. Some did look. Some objected. Their objections were overruled. The files waited. They waited through the Korean War, through the Cuban Missile Crisis, through Vietnam, through the moon landing, through Watergate, through the Reagan years. The files waited until 1999, when Congress finally said, "Show us what's in there." And it turned out, the truth had been there all along, in the original folder, under the paperclip, exactly where they left it. If stories like this one matter to you, if the history that gets classified is the history you want to understand, this channel covers exactly that. You know what to do. The last piece of this story happened in 2006. Hubertus struggled. H-E-W-Bertus struggled. He had been recruited through Operation Paperclip. He had become, in America, the founding father of space medicine. His research helped make it possible for human beings to survive in space. In 1978, he was inducted into the International Space Hall of Fame, an honor he held for 28 years. In 2006, new documentation emerged connecting him to the high-altitude and freezing experiments conducted at Dachau during the war. Experiments on prisoners, without consent, to test what happened to human beings in extreme conditions. His name was removed from the International Space Hall of Fame. He had been dead since 1986. The honor was revoked, posthumously, 20 years after he died, 60 years after the experiments. That is how long some of this took to be acknowledged. What do we do with a story like this? What does it mean that the program that put Americans on the moon was built in part by men who had used concentration camp prisoners as slave labor? What does it mean that the American government knew this, modified the files to hide it, and sustained the program for 15 years? What does it mean that when journalists began to expose it, as the Boston Globe did with Walter Schreiber in 1951, the response was not accountability, but quiet emigration to Argentina? These are not comfortable questions for people who grew up believing in the clarity of the Second World War. The good guys against the bad guys. The liberation of the camps. The Nuremberg trials. Justice. And most of that is true. But Operation Paperclip existed in the same years as Nuremberg, while the United States was prosecuting Nazi war criminals in one building. It was recruiting them in another. Both things happened at the same time, by the same government. The files prove it. Werner von Braun died in June of 1977 of pancreatic cancer at the age of 65 in Alexandria, Virginia, not far from Washington. He received a state funeral of sorts. President Carter issued a statement praising his contributions to American science. He is buried at Ivy Hill Cemetery in Lexington, Virginia. His headstone cites a verse from the Psalms. The heavens declare the glory of God. He spent his American life between those two things, the heavens, and what was buried underground, in tunnels, where 20,000 people died, building the weapon that made him famous enough to be given a new country, and a clean file, and a paperclip. But von Braun was only one man in a program of 1,600. Let's go back further. Because Operation Paperclip was not just about rockets. It was not just about biological weapons. It was also about intelligence. And the intelligence chapter of this story is, in some ways, the most consequential of all. His name was Reinhard Gehlen. Reinhard. He was a general in the German Army's Military Intelligence Service. During the war, Gehlen ran Germany's intelligence operations against the Soviet Union. He built a network of informants and agents across Eastern Europe. He accumulated files on Soviet military capabilities, Soviet political structure, Soviet intentions. By 1945, he had the most detailed intelligence picture of the Soviet Union, of anyone in the world, including, arguably, the Soviets themselves. And he knew it. In April of 1945, as Germany collapsed, Gehlen made the same calculation that Werner von Braun made. He selected his most important files, microfilmed them, buried the canisters in the Austrian Alps, and went looking for Americans to surrender to. He found them. In May of 1945, he made an offer. I have everything you need to know about the Soviet Union. I have the network. I have the files. I have the agents in place. Give me immunity. Give me funding. Let me keep running my network. Under your flag instead of ours. The Americans said yes. What became known as the Gehlen Organization operated quietly throughout the late 1940s and into the 50s. Funded by American intelligence, staffed by former German military intelligence officers, many of whom had documented connections to the SS and to Nazi atrocities in Eastern Europe. In 1956, when West Germany established its own federal intelligence service, the Bundesnachrichtendienst, Gehlen became its first director. He had gone from running intelligence for Hitler's Germany to running intelligence for the new West German Republic, without ever spending a day in prison, without ever facing accountability for what his network had done. His former Eastern European agents, many of whom had participated in the mass killings of Jewish populations during the German advance through Soviet territory, went with him. This is the part that the official histories skip. The Gehlen Organization was not just a collection of intelligence professionals who happened to have worn different uniforms during the war. It was a network built from men who had been part of the apparatus of mass murder, and the United States funded it, for years, because it was useful. Now let me ask you a question. You've been watching this story. You know about the rockets. You know about the biological weapons experts. You know about the intelligence network. Do you think these were isolated decisions, independent choices made by a few rogue officers? Or was this something more systematic? Here is what the documents show. The Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, the body that ran Operation Paperclip, reported to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. The Joint Chiefs reported to the Secretary of Defense. At various points, the Secretary of State, the Secretary of War, and senior officials in the executive branch were briefed on the program. When the State Department objected, and they did object, more than once, those objections went to the Secretary of Defense, and were overruled. This was not rogue. This was policy, made at the highest levels of the American government, sustained across multiple administrations. Truman, Eisenhower, Kennedy, all of them, to varying degrees, presided over a government that was running this program. The question of how much each of them personally knew, and when they knew it, is complicated. The question of whether the institution of the United States government made a deliberate choice to prioritize Cold War advantage over war crimes accountability is not complicated at all. It did. Fort Bliss, Texas, October 1945. Werner von Braun and 125 of his team members arrived. The Army had prepared for them housing, laboratory space, security, everything a rocket scientist could want, except freedom of movement. The scientists were technically under a form of house arrest. They were not supposed to leave the base without escorts, not supposed to contact journalists, not supposed to discuss their pasts. The official story they were given to tell was simple. They were German scientists who had worked on German technology. Now they were helping America. The war was over. The future was the point. Werner von Braun embraced this. He was charming. He was articulate. His English was excellent. He understood Americans. He had grown up reading science fiction about space travel. He believed in it, genuinely. Whatever else he was, whatever he had done, he wanted to go to space. He was also a brilliant self-promoter. By the early 1950s, he was writing popular science articles for Collier's magazine, making the case for a space station, for a mission to Mars, for sending human beings beyond the atmosphere. Disney approached him. They made a television special, Man in Space, 1955. 40 million Americans watched Werner von Braun explain the future of space exploration. He was magnificent, calm, clear, visionary. He looked like exactly what America wanted him to look like. A scientist who dreamed of the stars, not an SS major who visited the tunnels at Nordhausen. The Paperclip was doing its job. 1957, October 4th. The Soviet Union launched Sputnik. The satellite was the size of a beach ball. It transmitted a radio signal on a frequency anyone could hear. It circled the Earth every 98 minutes. America was stunned, not just by the technology, by what it implied. If the Soviets could put something in orbit, they could put a nuclear warhead on a ballistic missile and reach the United States. The space race stopped being abstract. It became existential. And the man who had been quietly working at the Army's ballistic missile program in Huntsville, Alabama, suddenly became the most important scientist in the country. Werner von Braun was given resources, authority, a direct line to the White House. His team worked around the clock. On January 31st, 1958, Explorer 1, the first American satellite, reached orbit. America had answered Sputnik. With a rocket built by a former SS major and his clean file, under the Paperclip. Huntsville, Alabama, mid-1950s, a small city that had spent most of its history in cotton and railroads. Now it was home to Redstone Arsenal, home to the rocket team, home to 125 German scientists and their families. The Army had thought carefully about integration. The scientists needed to be productive. They needed to feel settled. They needed to not be disturbed by awkward questions about the past. So the Army set up a community, housing on the base first. Then, as the program expanded and became more permanent, housing in Huntsville itself. There was a German language club, social events, a soccer league. The scientists' children went to Huntsville public schools. Werner von Braun taught Sunday school at Trinity Lutheran Church. He coached youth soccer. He was, by the consistent testimony of people who knew him in Huntsville, a genuinely warm and engaging man. Someone who remembered names. Who asked about your family. Who could make you feel like the most interesting person in the room. He was also building rockets that would eventually carry human beings to the moon. And when he wasn't doing either of those things, he was managing the gap between who he was being asked to be and what was in the original file. One historian who interviewed people who had known von Braun in Huntsville described it this way. He was performing America. Not dishonestly. He believed in it. He had chosen it. But he was always performing. Because a man with his past, in a country that didn't know his past, is always performing. What did he tell people when they asked about the war? He said he had been a scientist, that he had wanted to build rockets, that the Nazis had provided the funding and he had provided the engineering, that the rest of it was not his department. Tom Lehrer, the satirist, wrote a song about von Braun in 1965. The key line was, "Once the rockets are up, who cares where they come down? That's not my department," says Werner von Braun. Von Braun's people were not amused, but the line stuck, because it captured something true about the moral position von Braun had constructed for himself. He was the man who aimed the rocket at the sky. Whatever happened on the ground was someone else's problem. 1963. A group of former prisoners from Mittelbau-Dora, survivors of the concentration camp that had supplied the labor for V2 production, traveled to the United States. They had heard that the men responsible for their imprisonment were living freely in America, working for the American government, honored, celebrated. They wanted to testify. They wanted someone to listen. They went to the State Department. They went to the Department of Justice. They wrote letters. They gave interviews to journalists. The response they received was bureaucratic, polite, effectively dismissive. The decisions had been made. The files had been cleared. The scientists had been given citizenship. The program was considered closed. One of the survivors, Jean Michel, a French engineer who had been imprisoned at Dora, later wrote a memoir. He described meeting American officials who looked at his documentation and then told him, "These men are doing important work. The past cannot be undone." Jean Michel wrote, "They looked at me like I was the inconvenient one." He spent the rest of his life trying to make people understand what had happened at Dora. He eventually succeeded, partially. The Mittelbau-Dora Memorial was established. His testimony contributed to it. He died in 2004, still fighting, 40 years after he first knocked on the door in Washington. Here is a question worth asking. What did the other scientists in the program know about each other? They had worked together in Germany. They knew each other's histories. They had, in some cases, worked at the same facilities, visited the same tunnels, signed the same orders. When they arrived in America and were told to keep their pasts quiet, they kept each other's pasts quiet, too. It was a collective silence, maintained for decades. Not because they were forced to, because it was in everyone's interest, including, arguably, the interest of the American institutions that had recruited them. The Army needed the rockets. NASA needed the rockets. The Air Force needed the expertise. Everyone needed the past to stay in the original file, under the paperclip, where it wouldn't cause problems. This kind of collective silence, sustained over decades by multiple parties with aligned interests, is one of the most effective ways to keep a secret. Not because every person involved is actively lying all the time, but because no one has an incentive to be the person who breaks the silence. Until the documents start coming out, and the journalists start filing requests, and the historians start reading what they find. 1969, two things happened. In July, Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin landed on the moon. Werner von Braun watched from Houston and wept. In February, Werner von Braun testified at the West German consulate in New Orleans about the slave labor at Mittelbau-Dora. Those two events were separated by 5 months. In July, he was the man who had gotten America to the moon. In February, he was a witness in a war crimes trial who minimized what he had seen. Both of those things were the same man. In the same year. In the same country. If most Americans were unaware of the February testimony, it was not an accident. It was not widely covered. NASA had, by multiple accounts, worked to minimize the publicity around it. The moon landing was covered by every camera in the world. The testimony was not. The Saturn V itself. Stand at the Kennedy Space Center today and look at the Saturn V on display. 363 feet tall, 6.2 million pounds of thrust at liftoff. The most powerful rocket ever built. Still the most powerful rocket ever built. It flew 13 times between 1967 and 1973. 12 of those flights were successful. It sent 24 human beings to the moon, 12 of them walked on the surface. No one has built anything like it since, and it was designed by a team led by a man who joined the Nazi Party in 1937. Was commissioned as an SS major in 1941, visited the Mittelbau-Dora tunnel complex at least a dozen times, and arrived in the United States in 1945 with a clean file and a paperclip. Both of those things are true, they exist together, they cannot be separated. The Saturn V was built by Werner von Braun. Werner von Braun's past was deliberately concealed from the American public by the American government. The concealment was successful for decades. The truth is now in the declassified record, all of that is true. At the same time. About the same rocket. There is something specific that happened in the process of building the Saturn V that the official histories do not discuss. The welding. The tunnel sections at Mittelbau-Dora had been welded by prisoners, working in shifts, under conditions that killed them. The prisoners had learned, some of them, that a bad weld, deliberately bad, could cause a rocket to fail. This was their form of resistance, the only form available to them. 200 prisoners were executed for sabotage, many more were beaten. The camp's death rate was higher than almost any other forced labor facility in the Reich. The American engineers who came after. The engineers at Redstone Arsenal in the 1950s. The engineers at Marshall Space Flight Center in the 1960s. They solved the welding problems. They improved the alloys. They developed new techniques. They built a rocket that did not fail because of bad welds. Were they building on knowledge gained at the cost of those lives? The technical history is not entirely clear. Some knowledge transfers directly. Some does not. What is clear is that the men who supervised the wartime welding program, several of them, were now supervising the peacetime one, with new files and paperclips. Today, if you visit Huntsville, Alabama, you will find a city that is enormously proud of its space history. The U.S. Space and Rocket Center, the Saturn V on display, the murals, the museums, the children on school field trips who look up at the rocket with genuine wonder. That wonder is real. The achievement it represents is real. The history underneath it is also real. Huntsville has, in recent years, begun to grapple more honestly with that history. The Space and Rocket Center has information about Operation Paperclip, about the scientists' pasts, about what happened in the tunnels. It is not buried anymore, but it took decades to get there. And it took journalists and historians and survivors and declassified documents to make it happen. The paperclip eventually came off. The original file came out from underneath. And what was in it was exactly what had been put there. In 1945, by the men who decided that winning the Cold War was worth any price, including the truth, including accountability, including the dignity of the 20,000 people who died in the tunnels, building the weapon that built the myth, that built the rocket, that got to the moon, and back. There is one more layer to this story, one that most Americans have never heard. The survivors, not American survivors of the war. The survivors of the tunnels, the men who have been forced to build the V2 under conditions that killed 20,000 of their fellow prisoners. Some of them survived. Some of them made it out of the camps in April of 1945 when American forces arrived. Some of them lived long enough to see what happened next, to watch the men who had supervised their imprisonment receive American citizenship, receive honors, receive television specials. Jean-Michel was one of them, a French engineer. He had been a prisoner at Dora. He had worked in the tunnels. He had seen the hangings, 200 of them for sabotage, men executed for loose screws and bad welds, for quiet acts of desperation in the dark. After the war, Jean-Michel tried to tell what had happened. He found that no one particularly wanted to hear it. The Cold War was urgent. The space race was urgent. What had happened in the tunnels was historical. He eventually wrote a memoir, titled Dora, published in 1975, 30 years after the war. It was not a bestseller. It did not change policy, but it was there, in the record. For the historians who came later, Jean-Michel died in 2004. He spent the last years of his life watching the Mittelbau-Dora Memorial finally be established, watching documentaries about the V2 program that, increasingly, included some of what he had tried to say for 50 years. He did not live to see the full declassification that came after the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act. But the act was passed. The files came out. The documents confirmed what he had said. The truth was there. It had always been there, in the original file, under the paperclip. Today, in 2025, the legacy of Operation Paperclip continues to be felt in ways that are sometimes invisible. The American space program, which gave the world weather satellites, communications satellites, GPS navigation, and the International Space Station, was built in significant part by men recruited through Paperclip. The American Biological Warfare Research Program, some of which was later conducted at Fort Detrick in Maryland, had connections to the expertise brought in through Paperclip. The American intelligence apparatus, particularly its Cold War operations against the Soviet Union, was built in part on the foundation of the Gehlen Organization, which Reinhard Gehlen had handed to American intelligence in the Austrian Alps in 1945. These are not distant historical abstractions. The satellite that guides your phone's navigation system exists because of a space program built by Paperclip scientists. The intelligence agencies that operate today have institutional roots that go back to networks that were staffed by former SS officers. The biological and chemical warfare research conducted during the Cold War drew on expertise that had been learned in concentration camps. You did not choose any of this. Most Americans did not know any of it for decades. That is precisely the point. Decisions were made, at the highest levels of government, deliberately, with full knowledge of what was being traded away. And the people who paid the price for those decisions were not American. They were Polish, French, Soviet, Dutch, Belgian, Jewish. They were the 20,000 who died in the tunnels. The prisoners who urinated on electrical components as their only act of resistance. The men who were hanged for sabotage. The women who were experimented on at Ravensbrück. They paid the price. America got the rocket. What do you do with history like this? You don't dismantle the moon landing. You don't pretend the Saturn V didn't exist. You don't erase what was achieved. But you don't pretend the original file doesn't exist either. You take the paperclip off. You read both documents, the clean summary and the truth underneath it, and you understand that the country you live in, the country that sent human beings to the moon, made choices that were not clean, that the price of some of America's greatest achievements was paid by people whose names are not on any monument in Washington. Their names are on the memorial at Mittelbau-Dora, in Germany, at the site of the tunnels. If you go there, you can read them. The people who built the rocket are famous. The people who died building it are there. In the record, both files exist. The truth was never destroyed. It was only filed, under a clean summary, attached with a paperclip, and now you know what was underneath. That is the country that got to the moon. And that is the country that took 70 years to read its own file. Both things are true. They always were. Here is a detail that history tends to skip. In 1953, the Central Intelligence Agency launched a program called MK-Ultra. MK-Ultra was the CIA's research program into mind control, behavioral modification, the use of drugs, particularly LSD, to alter human consciousness. The program was illegal. It used unwitting American and Canadian citizens as test subjects. It ran for decades. When the files were discovered in 1977, Congress held hearings. The country was outraged. What was not widely discussed in those hearings was the intellectual lineage. The MK-Ultra researchers were interested in the same question that Nazi medical researchers had been interested in. What does it take to break a person, to make them compliant, to override their will? The Nazi doctors had conducted experiments on this question, on prisoners, in concentration camps, without consent, with lethal results in many cases. Those researchers, or their data, or their methods, had connections to the programs that followed. The full documentation of exactly how much MK-Ultra drew on Nazi research methods is still not entirely clear. The bulk of the MK-Ultra files were ordered destroyed by CIA Director Richard Helms in 1973. Before the congressional investigation. Before anyone could see them. What survived suggests connections. The exact depth of those connections was buried with the files. Let me tell you about the journalists. Because this story would never have come out at all without them. In 1951, reporter Howard Blakesley at the Boston Globe started asking questions about Walter Schreiber. He found the documents. He wrote the story. The story ran. People read it. The military denied everything. Arranged Schreiber's emigration to Argentina. And the story faded. In 1984, investigative journalist Linda Hutt began filing Freedom of Information Act requests. Hundreds of them, over years. She was trying to get access to the original paperclip files, not the clean summaries, the originals. Most of her requests were denied. Some were partially granted. What she received, piece by piece, began to show the shape of what had happened. In 1991, she published her book Secret Agenda,
The first comprehensive account of what Operation Paperclip had actually involved. It was largely ignored. Too early. Too few documents. Too much still classified. It took the Nazi War Crimes Disclosure Act of 1999 to open the files properly. And it took Annie Jacobson's 2014 book, simply titled Operation Paperclip, to synthesize everything into a complete public narrative. Nearly 70 years after the tunnels at Nordhausen. That is how long it takes to bury a truth completely.
And how long it can take to dig it back out. There is one more person in this story who deserves more than a footnote. His name was Eli Rosenbaum. Eli Rosenbaum. He was the director of the Office of Special Investigations at the Department of Justice. From 1995 to 2015, his job was to investigate Nazi war criminals who had made it to the United States. Find them, document them. Prosecute them if possible, deport them if prosecution wasn't viable. He knew about Operation Paperclip, he knew about the file falsifications, and he knew that many of the Paperclip scientists had been given protection that his office could never pierce. Not because the evidence wasn't there. Because the national security apparatus had made decisions decades earlier that were now legally and politically entrenched. The men who had been brought in, given citizenship, given careers, given honors, were protected by the very system that had recruited them. In some cases, by the time his office could have acted, they were dead. Arthur Rudolph, 89, Hamburg. Werner von Braun, 65, Virginia. Kurt Blome, died 1969. Walter Schreiber, died 1980. In Buenos Aires. Most of them died in their beds. In the countries that had protected them. What does it mean to hold all of this at once? What does it mean to look at the moon? That pale disk that billions of human beings have watched since before recorded history, and know that the rockets that carried Americans that were built by a program that falsified war crimes files. What does it mean for the families of the 20,000 people who died at Mittelbau-Dora, who watched America give their killers new lives and new honors? What does it mean for Americans who grew up proud of Apollo, who remember July 20th, 1969, as one of the great moments of human civilization? All of those things can be true at the same time. The engineering achievement was real. The moral compromise was real. The deliberate concealment was real. The cold calculation that made it all possible was real. None of those truths cancels the others. They all exist. In the same folder, one under the other, connected by a paperclip. The tunnels at Nordhausen are still there. Parts of them, tourists can visit. There is a memorial, photographs, information about the prisoners who died there, 20,000 of them, from across occupied Europe, from France and Poland and the Soviet Union and Holland and Belgium, from the concentration camps, worked until they could not work, and then left in the dark. Their names are documented as the names in von Braun's file. They are simply not as famous. They did not build the rocket that got us to the moon. They were the fuel. And the country that made it to the moon did not spend much time, for a very long time, asking about the cost of the ticket. If you watched this story to the end, write one word in the comments. Paperclip, and tell us what city you're watching from, because this story was buried for decades. And the people who are most responsible for it, finally coming out, are the journalists and historians who spent years filing requests, reading documents, and refusing to let the original file stay under the clean summary. This is what accurate history looks like. Not comfortable. Not simple. But true.